Society and Delusion. This is an essay I wrote that I finished yesterday. And I just want to present it. So yeah, shout out to my little sister who's right at the door. You probably just heard her whisper. Um,
I'm the inspiration.
she was not the inspiration. Um, I have like a weird setup. I'm recording this on my monitor, and I'm using my school laptop to do the face cam and also read off of the essay. So it's kind of weird. You probably see me looking at the camera, looking at the text, and looking over here for some reason. And it's all because I need to see all three of them. Maybe not that one. Maybe not my camera, but whatever. Um, so let's start. Um, Abstract. So what is this about? Um, so society's two forces, the practical and theoretical or conceptual, which I will get into what that is, ultimately run counter to each other. They contradict, specifically in technologically and intellectually advancing societies, and more particularly those groups, within that group, capitalistic societies, and thereby disparate ones in regards to class and whatnot. This clash results in cyclic, self-meaningful societies with a fundamental limit to how much that they can advance regarding their organization, regarding intellectual advancement, and regarding technological advancement. So, before I go and do anything, I'd like to preface. So, originally, the context of this essay was in regards to things that were happening in the US, but as I kept on writing, it got a little bit different. So, I'm still gonna say that though. Also, I'm not really fit for tackling a topic like this. I have no formal academic background in any of the subjects that I'm talking about. Instead, I mainly use my reasoning faculties to establish all of my conclusions. So logically, you could just follow the arguments without much actual anecdotal um, or historical references. Yeah, for the sake of just improving and doing better, I would love feedback or like corrections on any of the arguments that I make, or even like the way I deliver stuff. I know I can do better at speaking, but just any sort of criticism, constructive or not, I guess, I'd appreciate. And if you'd like to read the actual essay, whether it's because you don't have time or you don't like hearing me or I'm not a good speaker or you just prefer reading, it should be in the description. I'm not sure where exactly I'll host it, but we'll figure that out later. Okay, firstly, the agglomeration of selfishness breeds selflessness. It's kind of a strange concept. Fundamentally, the human exigence for action is purely self-beneficial. Strangely, however, we see that there is an emphasis and general or holistic prevalence on selfless behavior and actions. This is the result of the context involving the condition or nature of the environment which this human behavior exists in. In a complete vacuum in all respects except for which is necessary, given the chance to decide between two things. Most fundamentally, we will observe behavior from an individual that aligns with what we generally perceive as selfish behavior, simultaneously coinciding with the fundamental nature of that action, distinct from contextualized selflessness, such as sacrifice, usually born from a development of connection with others or another for the selfish purpose of feeling fulfillment, safety, and community or others, or holistically it is perceived as selfless, though the fundamental core is selfish. The ideas around selfish and selfless behavior are constantly subject to ever-changing ideas, and they kind of get bogged down and mixed with moral language. I will talk about morality, but that's separate from when I speak about selfishness and selflessness. So I'm going to briefly define what I mean by them. Selfishness is the quality or condition of being concerned chiefly with one's own benefit, and selflessness is concerned more with the needs and wishes of others than with one's own needs and wishes. And that's from the Oxford Languages Dictionary definition. Um, all action, as devised previously, is most fundamentally selfish. The identification or emergence of selflessness and the idea thereof only comes about when actions become contextualized and thereby, through that context, then perceived in a holistic manner. As individuals, we typically strive for self preservation. In the pursuit of this condition, we must use our capabilities of rationalization in order to ascertain the most appealing, which typically is the most accessible and valuable for or to us, set of options. We must make a series of decisions so that we are able to effectively respond to dynamic environments. With the inclusion of numerous actors of other humans, our survival is threatened. The most appealing option begins to change as the circumstances or condition of the environment which synthesizes these options change. The choices we make are a function of the condition of the environment. So, for example, an environment with limited resources. In this case, let the limited resource be food that we focus on. Let's say this food happens to be in a place that is significantly difficult to reach, requiring a measure of strength of brawn. In environments like these, only those with the strength would survive because they're the only ones who get food. And again, there could be exceptions. There could be a mother or a father who has that strength that can provide for his family or something like that. But again, just bare bones example here. Only through the cooperation of the physically weaker individuals is this truth threatened. For a physically weaker individual seeking survival, chiefly concerned with their own well-being and benefiting themselves, they're then forced to collaborate with others, breeding a sentiment of, but not quite yet reaching, selflessness. Adding countless other factors to the environment and further complicating the states or attributes of individuals, we see the emergence of society and morality. Essentially, cooperation becomes essential. Morality is the natural description of the sentiment of cooperation or the system of interaction, while simultaneously and by extension protecting the institution of society by inspiring popular condemnation of behavior which could threaten the structure of the institution. A byproduct of this collaboration and communion is advancement, and this is demonstrated throughout human history, but argumentatively and philosophically, for my purposes, we can say that this advancement is established as a logical inference coming from a biological or the biological truth of human behavior, irrespective of history. That is to say, advancement is necessitated by definition as the gears that drive individual behavior that we spoke about earlier, and ultimately a system of interaction between individuals is predicated on an increase in happiness, fulfillment, survival, or whatever, which is accomplished through the creation and development of tools and intelligence. Or to rephrase, to maximize and guarantee this pleasure and survival, which would definitionally be the case, innovation would eventually emerge. This innovation is what we see as and what I would call advancement. So this is technology, this is innovation. The tools which make survival possible become cleaner, faster, better, more accessible. This births more opportunity, breeding a rise in intellectualism. Of course, this isn't the only factor for an increase in intelligence, or more accurately, the acquisition and expansion of knowledge, nor for the creation of an intellectual class, but each of the other factors ultimately stem from the proliferation of society. Ultimately, advancement, as we may devise, executed to a significant degree, begins to blur and complicate the nature of one's own existence, as survival, purely in relation to the preservation of human life, is all but guaranteed in areas of developed nations I speak of. Of course, even in developed nations, there are regions where this is not the case. And therefore, our behaviors begin to shift as the conditions which inform the behaviors have been subverted or altered, causing the algorithm which determines what is most appealing, that materializes our behaviors, or of the greatest interest, to change. A conclusion that makes it terribly difficult to declare any driving idea or the driving idea or force or principle for human behavior. With this in mind, I've only declared principles which I find reasonable to be assumed in each respective context that I speak in. The declarations that I make can be found from the simplification of the complexities of these scenarios. On this matter, this assumption can be deduced argumentatively because our behavior is still determined by the same biological compositions, something which evolution has not had the chance to significantly change, given the time frame and species humans that I speak of. That's fundamentally limiting the range of the measure of change in traditional behavior, as both are bound by. With this in mind, I now assert that the advancement of society breeds conflict to the very structure or existence of society as a whole. We will contextualize this now. So, society doesn't exist purely on intellectual grounds. The rationalization process of humanity, or of humans in general, is invariably influenced by non rational, though systematic, structures, most particularly emotions. This engagement in non rational thinking has established a significant foundation in the structure of society and has bred what I will henceforth call delusion. For practical purposes, the definition is as follows: a false belief or judgment about external reality, originally manufactured specifically to alter one's own or others' perception or experience of reality. And quickly on the word false, um, it's important to recognize that subjective beliefs are excluded from this definition as they can't be evaluated on the scale of objectivity. Correct, incorrect. The demarcation between subjective beliefs and delusions are precisely on this foundation. A delusion is something that can be evaluated to be either correct or incorrect, um, or at least its core tenet. The ability to do so for any particular belief can be largely debated, and I don't really have any interest in contributing to that debate right now. So it's left for you as the reader or as the listener or the viewer to decide. But for the purposes of this argument, all of the implications on delusion cannot be applied to subjective beliefs because the implications rely on the idea that a delusion is fundamentally false. So, for our purposes, we will only deal with significant examples of delusion. Intentionality was developed into this definition to exclude delusions which are simply the result of misinformation or erred observations. And the portion of the definition which describes this delusion as being held despite um, incontrovertible evidence in like the dictionary has been removed primarily because of my hesitancy toward the word and like its implications, but also my realization that um, the definition can still hold without. So, significant delusion is defined as a delusion which meaningfully interacts with or alters or is embedded within the core beliefs of an individual, especially that of their perception or understanding of the meaning of life. Now, delusion, to a certain extent, is necessary for the institution and continuation of society. It follows that without delusion, society could not exist. Generally, delusion acts as the second foundation for morality. The first foundation, as we discussed, is the ubiquitous attempt at survival. However, given the advancement of a society, which is intrinsic and a requirement for these constructs, as explained prior, this alone is not enough. That's not to say that this attempt towards survival is fundamentally separate from morality, but instead a natural extension of it. They are the same thing. Indeed, innovation, technological and intellectual, challenges established power structures in societies, manifest from expressions of morality as by definition, whereby the primary, as in beginning and foundational, part of one of the most efficient or effective responses to this challenging is the institution of delusion. This is typically one of the initial factors leading to several revolutions that we see in history. It is important now to acknowledge a particular facet of this collaboration, in part to demonstrate the nature of morality, I declare. It's the question of corruption. This particular question can be quite perplexing when we beg it from the perspective or perspectives of those who live the experience of the consequences of corruption. However, we find that the nature of the answer becomes increasingly lucid once we actually apply the frames of logic we consistently use elsewhere here. As previously acknowledged, and as I shall repeat consistently, individuals act most fundamentally out of complete self-interest. You'll see me say the fundamental human exigence a lot. The fundamental exigence for human behavior, rather. The institution of morality is only formed when the pressures from the environment demand it, which fundamentally is instantaneous as it is definitionally society. However, I'm more particularly talking about on an individual level. Assuming an individual did not have to compete for resources or was completely uncontestable in their environment, even from rivaling cooperation, they will have no reason to subscribe to any moral beliefs about property or rights or anything else except that which only advances them further. Indeed, when they felt it most pleasurable, they would take what they wanted, for there are no repercussions or personal vulnerabilities they will face for their actions, except potentially any barriers created from alterations of perceived value, typically in cases of deep emotional connection with another individual. So they might not steal from a person that they have deep emotional ties to because the perceived value changes. They prefer to keep this friendship for one reason or another. The same is to say for modern corruption. The institution of morality exists in a slightly different state here, though. It has been so quintessentially engraved within the very construct of society, partially because of illusion, as will be explained, of which the family, beyond parent and offspring conceptually, is a product of, which is the creator of the individual who is to be corrupt, that a certain level of emotion cannot be revoked. Indeed, emotions guide most of our decisions, and some are evolutionary responses to the need for cooperation. So, to a pretty extreme extent, it is biologically determined. However, this connection to morality is not the same for those who live because of it. That is to say, for example, those living off of tax subsidized health programs who are otherwise incapable of providing for themselves, a truth reinforced by the system of interaction or nature or condition of society. Of course, generally, you would see those individuals cling onto and emphasize this morality to a stronger degree. This or their sentiment isn't far off from a general popular sentiment on morality, especially in America, given people of this or an adjacent class are the majority. Those of corruption typically simply don't have that connection. For the very accidents, the cause for morality's creation has been eradicated. To a significant degree, the various potential oppositions to that individual survival, beyond just the preservation of life, also um, social survival, given the broad applicability of the scenario in history, are no longer present to threaten or disavow immoral behavior. Ultimately, this leads to a significant crumbling in the institution of ethics and morality in the perspective of that individual. The more this individual is removed from society, the more this effect is enhanced. Indeed, for those whose power, of which they take advantage of, is dependent on popular sentiment or a general engagement with those of lower statuses, who are more likely to be invigorated in the spirit of morality, this crumbling can't go to such extremes, as these individuals hopefully realize that they are not completely free from this threat of survival. If it is seen that they act so grotesquely out of line with whatever this society is able to observe, at whatever climax or inflection point for that individual or role, their position can be threatened or removed, causing their survival and well-being to significantly erode. For those with a skewed sense of reality, the behavior may unintentionally ride this inflection line or critical point, as what they understand to be immoral has differed significantly from what popular belief is, most typically because of, again, a significant disconnect from society. Though in this case, it is whilst their position is dependent on the society's acceptance of them, such as ignorant heir to a dynastic monarchy. In a significantly sheltered lifestyle, common perspectives die. What we find interestingly is, if conscious, through a deviation and ultimate subversion of this morality, which could be suggested in the theory of revolution, which would effectuate the pursuit toward a new society of greater morals, morality is strengthened as the subverters, to continue their subversion, institute an extension of delusion, though this is not the only conclusion one can draw. Now, getting back on track, as we have ascertained, by the nature of the very definition and concept of society, advancement must happen. We can condense this advancement for our purposes to that of technology. Technological advancement ultimately requires an enhancement of intellectualism, especially given the increasing complexity of certain or most technologies over the course of several generations of continuous knowledge flow and the pursuit of answers to greater problems, enabled by the conquering of more fundamental problems in relation to originally survival. So this is like the mechanization of agriculture and the movement of the general population away from agriculture into more urban environments, because they no longer have to work that, because there's already technology that allows them to do so. So they can focus on other things. Efficient intellectual advancement requires a sentiment of curiosity. The scientific method represents this efficient methodology of curiosity as compared to other processes which ultimately result in technological advancement, given the scientific method has been observed rather to give consistent, verifiable results that generally, most probably, accurately ascertain or describe the processes and natures of things. Um, I say most probably, and it seemed a little redundant because of the fact that we can't verify whether or not our assumptions are like factually objective and whatnot. But whatever. We can assume that society, with its capabilities, would attempt to adopt the most efficient and accessible methodology of curiosity, given it's required for advancement, and advancement supports their quality of life or experience of pleasure. This now proliferate pursuit of curiosity breeds incredible skepticism and scrutiny. Existing systems are investigated. This curiosity can cause a lot of tension in social structures and political establishment. It can furthermore, if not regulated, cause internal disruption within the individual. Most important topics, such as the origin of existence and the universe, if applicable, and the meaning of life, are pondered. Without concrete and trustable figures to turn to, which possess these answers, that individual can experience immense distress, creating a non functional member of society. If these troubles are diffused or popularized in the society, collapse could pounce. This is less trouble for societies which have a special marginal class of intellectuals, especially if these intellectuals are treated well, due to this class being the minority, with the majority being uneducated and preoccupied. Their ability and probability to cause these effects could be minimized, but practically it's never zero. The motives for such an action are explained later. As suggested by revolution theory, which I'm not qualified to discuss, the structure likely wouldn't be permanent, and ultimately a more progressive and therefore universal advancement inclusive society will be born, whether through popular uprising as spurred from discontent or triumphed by the leaking and eventual dissemination of intelligence in the common populace, or more likely through consequential competition with regional powers who did not limit the intellectual and thereby technological, military, and political advancement or power. We don't typically find a dense system of existentialism when we look in our histories, particularly because the institution of delusion has already been established, which we shall get into, but also because this was the structure of society. The average individual simply didn't have enough time nor the proper education to ponder about ontology or philosophize about metaphysics. Instead, they were focused on getting by, surviving that day, subsistence, providing for their families, and other things. The time that they did have alone was likely filled by that institution of delusion we spoke of. Nonetheless, advancement prevails. To protect existing power structures or to promote productivity, there's an impetus to manufacture delusion. These delusions are varied in nature. One could emphasize a distraction from these essential questions, another could provide an answer, another could do both. This explains how delusion emerges or is enhanced in more advanced societies. However, it does not explain how delusion existed before these predicaments were necessarily frequent or expansive enough to prompt its creation, nor clearly illuminate the justification for an execution of a motive. For that, we must get more fundamental. In this, the manufacture of delusion in these cases is a result of selfishness, that fundamental exigence. Those in power will certainly establish, until they are satisfied and that there is no significantly reasonable threat posed to their position, safeguards in order to protect their power or position, especially in earlier systems that did not institute many other bodies, including social components, that could regulate authority, like checks and balances, the separation of powers, whether legally or by tradition, and in areas where political turmoil was frequent, therefore changes in power and usurpation were too, because it is an object of desire that is available and possess a positive net result. And again, by definition, this will be presumed. So take a quick note. Early societies are primarily used by me because the lucidity of their connection to these primary biological motives are the strongest. In the early societies, the main motive was, again, survival. As time goes on, the situations and conditions of human interaction are complicated, and this lucidity is less of the case, which is to explain why an intellectual elite would seemingly undermine their own position for the sake of dissemination of knowledge, mainly to a lower emergent elite instead of a working class, or people who most strongly depend on the system of interaction. Dependence. The rationale behind this is somewhat complex, but history serves as a verification that this does, in fact, happen, and in congruency with the assumption of selfishness at the benefit of the individual, though on a less explicit realm. One of the most essential and effective safeguards is delusion. Any mode of thought, the very foundation for action, that promotes or reinforces the reign or position of power, is adopted and expanded, or even constructed by themselves, largely with the assistance of the intelligence that they have access to due to their position. unlike other uh, classes. As explained, there are significantly reasonable threats posed to powerful people's position in these societies, most particularly other societies. Delusion is the second, though perhaps not final, step in changing that, and we would generally see those in power utilize this, as those who do not adapt to delusion will not survive. Another quick note: one can also acknowledge that some delusion is simply the natural extension of human connection. Oral stories and folk tales, for various sakes, are created and passed down from generation to generation, establishing tradition, but also partially due to a lack of rapid intellectual advancement in these time periods, as opposed to more recent times where technological advancement allowed for intellectual advancement to exponentially grow, establishing mythologies and whatnot. These tales, though, tie back to other sources of delusion ultimately, with their exigences coming from sources such as a need for comfort, survival, or societal cohesion. Delusion can be problematic, though. For delusion to be effective, it has to be resistant to the throes of advancement, including the effects of intellectualism. Popular intellectual advancement is perhaps the greatest opposition to false beliefs. For these delusions to reside in an area of safety, a general sum of compositions is typically adopted. Number one, delusion is socially reinforced through tradition. Number two, delusion resides in a special area of credulity and mysticism, such that it is easily adopted and trustable while simultaneously existing in a realm such that the gears of innovation, the scientific method, cannot properly appraise or scrutinize it. Let's investigate these two components more thoroughly. So, social reinforcement or tradition. The idea is pretty simple. The more people believe the delusion, the harder it is for natural investigation to effectively scrutinize it. This is true on multiple planes. In the mode of frequency, these investigations will require special social conditions or curious characters to allow the very questioning that begins the investigation, leading to significant infrequency as compared to a more progressive society. In the mode of belief, these findings must work against generations of indoctrination, and indeed, that's a hard ask. Typically, this is done by taking advantage of pre-existing grievances with social conditions, especially ones that work upon the institution or institutions of delusion, as described in revolution theory. The problem comes with effective communication and, additionally, any malicious opposition. Typically, given the second component we will discuss, mysticism and credulity, the nature of the delusion would take up that which is excessively hard to actually investigate or scrutinize. For one to properly convince others of the falsehood of the belief, or even begin to allow them to question it, those who they wish to express this to would typically require a large framework of existing knowledge or education to actually understand these complex explanations. This education typically gets rid of the secondary problem, which is a willingness to believe, where a general proliferation of intelligence inspires a sentiment of curiosity and questioning. Regardless, however, questioning the foundations of your very existence is a hard ask, even if those foundations are those which actively oppress oneself or others they care for. A great delusion would actively work to force its subject's experience of life and every aspect thereof to be viewed within the perspective of the delusion, such as family structures, a system of interaction emergent from biological foundations, but built upon by moral by moral ones, which in the modern age are the cornerstone of developed societies. If that is the case, the opposition is no longer investigating a belief, but a population's reality. Family structures, social institutions, economic establishments, practically everything then would be a proponent of that delusion. Indeed, a rise in intellectual investigation and investment could work against agitators. Through an individual's biases, one may come to use logic to support their delusions, creating a special construction of delusion which can, to an extent, coincide with expansion and advancement. The limitations thereof are explained soon. Especially in terms of morality as well, questioning or debilitating that delusion would include questioning the very foundation of society, life, relationships, and more. Therefore, the societal reinforcement aspect of delusion, tradition, is largely the strongest component of it. A great delusion is one that cannot be questioned. Given the natural limitations of human senses and therefore human knowledge, lots of questions are fundamentally beyond our capacity to answer, even with technology. Founding a delusion on these questions would employ great defenses against the natural expansion of human intellect and technological advancement. But strong delusions cannot exist purely on those foundations, typically. Fundamentally, one could answer a variety of those questions with completely different answers. And yet, it seems to be that all answers to these questions don't have the same level of credibility as other pre existing and socially accepted answers. This can largely be attributed to what was discussed earlier in tradition, but it is also because a delusion should typically interact with or relate to day to day experiences of the subjects. Usually, then, the delusion must be projected or presented in such a way that it relates to things that can be verified with sensory experiences, therefore enabling a scientifically criticizable aspect to the delusion. Ultimately, the more one can verify on one's own, through their own experiences, the perceived truth of the delusion, the more a delusion is likely to be adopted. Again, there must be a balance with these things, however. A delusion that relies too much on scrutable components is typically fragile. One of the ways that this is combated is with an institution of evolution and thereby selectivity and ambiguity. Beginning with the latter, ambiguity refers to the ability to interpret the delusion in such a way that is now able to negotiate or reconcile with new truth discovered. This is technically an aspect of evolution. Ambiguity only comes to harm the one that relies on the delusion to keep their power, the elite, in that the ambiguity can be then used to oppose them, or for the opposition, be used to scrutinize the institution through the institution, providing a measure of leeway in any accusations of dissent. As for evolution in general, the delusion needs to be able to adapt to, in some respect, technological advancement, though this has its own limitations. This is typically done through selectivity, where the individual now takes ownership over the delusion more thoroughly and allows themselves to pick and choose which parts they believe instead of disbanding it all, particularly because of the traditional reinforcement. In order to accurately work with an evolving technological and therefore intellectual sphere, which they must, else they will live less happy lives, given its relationship to status and opportunity. Though, as one may realize, this undermines certain aspects of the delusion, which ultimately weakens it, though perhaps not crucially for the individual, just those that rely on the non-central parts. Now we begin to see the problem. As discussed in Mysticism and Credulity, delusion typically must begin to negotiate and reconcile with the changing environment of thought. Long-lasting delusions are more resistant to change, however, as discussed in tradition, whereby they have established themselves in the very frameworks of society and its components such that it has imposed a natural limitation on them, the agents of change. Ultimately, technological advancement brings too many problems for delusion. Again, the strongest delusions are those which are socially reinforced. The social reinforcement is typically only done by a natural process of time, where it has passed and burgeoned through generations, which also means that the strongest delusions are the oldest ones. Human intelligence is limited to such a degree that the prediction of what can be challenged by the windings of technological advancements is effectively impossible. Ultimately, this results in a series of possibilities for the future of advancement in that society. One possibility is resistance. The more opposition and crusades effected against the delusion, the stronger the delusion provokes itself. This ultimately breeds extremism in one capacity. Any dissent is seen as treachery, and ultimately technology must then change to conform with it. Belief in the delusion becomes a requirement, and this ultimately invigorates societal regression. Old, discarded aspects of the delusion due to the advancement of society are re-evaluated and typically adopted, including that which could have oppressed, damaged, or was inefficient. This naturally opposes intellectualism. Crucially, in an increasingly intelligent society, many times unconsciously, aspects of strong delusions become entrenched within the identity of the individual to an extent that, even with the popular disbandment of the delusion, core tenets remain and are rebranded to conform with the identities of objectivity. The very institution that proposed and supported society then becomes its active user in halting its advancement, where now the society must sit in content with its beliefs. Of course, assuming that the society does not exist in a vacuum, that lack of technological advancement could likely result in the society becoming vulnerable to outside agitators, whether that be militaristically, ideologically, or otherwise. Another alternative that I haven't given much thought to, honestly, is the collapse of the delusion. Ultimately, the gears of advancement may be too efficient to be hindered by society, even though the advancement is parented by the delusion and the society it exists in and for is founded upon the delusion. Typically, in capitalistic economies like that we see in America, this technological advancement will occur as it is perceived to benefit the person who endeavors to do it. The collapse of this delusion would probably spell disaster for the society. Its system of governance would fundamentally be undermined, and ultimately, either another delusion must be established in its place, or a logical, factual system of governance will be established. The problem with the former is that the technological advancement and success or succession would make this probability significantly lower, if not practically impossible, without impeding on that rise of and previous extension of intellectualism and technological advancement. Not to mention the fragility and untrustworthiness of early delusion systems. The latter has so many more problems, though. For the very reasons that delusion itself is established, purely logical foundations for society cannot exist in the context of an intellectually and technologically supreme society. Contexts that beg the establishment of society, such as morality, are functionally worthless. A logical foundation would have to utilize aspects of the unobjective, such as emotions. The realization thereof isn't important either, in that the foundations of human existence and identity do not allow a life purely or even majorly of the objective, which is ultimately an incomplete life, given the limitations of knowledge, whether by time, the period, or of our sensory experiences. Yikes. Talking too much. Yeah. Ultimately, the grand majority of logical conclusions run counter to how practical individuals and societies actually run and function. This is very apparent in realms of morality, in charity, family, and childbearing, living, and so much more, of which each of these I'm positive one can tell how this is true. The fact of life brings too many problems with this, however. We are simply not logical creatures at our essences, as explained. We require those subjective aspects of sensation and experience for the continued existence of society. That is to say, society continues for the sake of continuing society. Truly, it is cyclical and self-meaningful. Now we get on to the implications of this. What does all this mean? These words seem to suggest that there is a fundamental limit for which a society can advance. If my logic is sound, that may be the case. Indeed, even for outside agitators for which a society limited by its own delusion is threatened by, the conclusion is ubiquitous, though occurring later. One problem with the limitations imposed by delusion is the necessitation for dissent that it proposes. There will be grievances, For there will be the curious, and simultaneously privileged with the resources to satiate it. A theory of revolution may propose that this structure cannot permanently exist, and further suggest that, outside of destruction, a pattern emerges, as declared by the saying, history repeats itself, rather through dissatisfaction brewed from a creeping of power in those empowered by delusions, and therefore a movement towards something more authoritarian, or through outside influence, or through the need for advancement, or through someplace and somehow else. Yet, again, after the chaos, they meet the same conclusion as the conditions are the same, just through a better or more time appropriate delusion. Ultimately, we are limited by the fundamental truths of our existences. Perhaps only through the emergence beyond that, which I reckon isn't likely or appealing for that matter, may we overcome this. As the discussion of humanity or any social organization or sociality is irrelevant past that point, by which I stand consistent in my mention of the practical and unpredictability of technological advancement. Ultimately, this speaks to the underlying fragility of these systems. As we understand, our entire society is predicated on the emergence of community, or more generally, non-self beneficial actions from the interaction between individual self-serving desires. Every form and magnitude of interaction, interpersonally to globally, belongs to such a truth. Take time to imagine how the system exists in larger structures such as geopolitical relations. The direct consequence of this system is a fundamental fragility within everything it supports. Perhaps this is the beginning for a further inquisition for you to the nature of yourself and the situation you exist in. Question the foundations that support the place you rest your head upon, and the foundations of that place, and its history, and your own ability to do as you were doing then. And then question your very self as the questioning leads. Indeed, may you find you rest upon fibers of linen and nothing, tethered together, somehow supporting one another and neither at the same time, yet emerging into a cohesive structure all in the end. Let these questions puzzle you and leave you questioning all the more, and hopefully end up with you admiring the beauty and absurdity of it all, or not. And I want to regurgitate this just as the end. These conclusions have no weight to the moral nature of the systems or methods I described. Adhering to the fact that morality is relative, or at least it's a fact to me, selfishness, if one is curious, belongs not immediately to either morally wrong or right. For any sort of determination of morality, one must contextualize. Now, to summarize, what is all of this? What did I say? What happened? So, number one, morality is the description of a system or the system of interaction between individuals, a society. Two, morality itself is not sufficient for the upkeep of society. This is because advancement, as necessitated by this system of interaction, fundamentally undermines or subverts the system of interaction. This subversion comes about because intellectual advancement and the fundamental exigence of behavior emphasizes curiosity, which can scrutinize the system of interaction and reveal its flaws, partially compromising it. So the emergence from morality, the system of interaction, fundamentally subverts morality. Delusion is the natural extension of morality, the solution to the problems that come about the expansion of society, even physically, as a function of advancement by time. Delusion is supported or propelled by the individuals who rely on the system of interaction, otherwise they would, as they understand it, be worse off. We can call these people dependents. These dependents who are more likely to be less educated, as in the beginning of the system, these people are primarily occupied with subsistence activities that disallow them to engage within leisure or secondary education simply because of lack of time. And going a little bit further here, when intellectual advancement spreads more equally, it is still the descendants of the original dependents who support this morality because they too depend on it, but most particularly because the delusion which is established is likely to be one reinforced by tradition. The support is more to this, the latter, than their factual dependence, the former, because the dependence in mechanized societies is largely invisible. So these dependents will consume any good delusion that supports this fracturing morality. This delusion is largely manufactured by the elite or those who hold power, who are initially, in the beginning of a system of interaction, empowered to create one because it will solidify their position, guaranteeing them safety and thereby increasing their self-pleasure or survival or fulfillment as destined by the rule of the algorithm of behavior. Given as this is the beginning of a system of interaction, there is little complex or expansive checks and balances, politically and personally, that restrict this. With both the support of the elite and the dependents, the delusion is firmly established. Number 4, the establishment of delusion fundamentally conflicts with the advancement of society, as the gears of a necessitated intellectual and technological advancement keep spinning without respect for the truth of a delusion. To keep society stable, delusion must limit advancement, and it largely does so with the support of the dependents and the elite. So, in the end, a glamour interaction is society, is morality, is delusion. And that is it. That is it. That is the essay, Society and Delusion. If you got anything out that I'm surprised because reading this was awful. I use a lot of words. I don't mean to like intentionally make my writing like hard to approach, but in order to be precise with what I say, in order to like avoid um, being vague to where I don't like address all of the nuances, I sort of complicate. I use different, more accurate words to describe what I'm trying to say. And ultimately, that means that I sacrifice being clear with what I'm saying for precision in what I'm saying. I'm sure that there are people out there who are capable of doing both, or maybe you have to simplify a little bit to actually communicate. But maybe not. I don't know. Maybe that's what politics and speaking is. But anyway, I hope you got something out of that. Again, the actual essay is available to read in the description for free or whatever. I don't know why I would block it if I have the whole thing here that I just read out. Yeah, that's about it. This is my first time doing anything like this. So I would definitely appreciate feedback, and I would certainly love it if there were examples of how my argument just doesn't work, or like maybe I'm speaking about topics that already been spoken about. So maybe I should do some reading if there's some reading that relates to what I'm saying. Maybe talk about that. I don't know. I'm just here for the feedback. Thank you guys. Yeah, that's it. That's it. It's 11:42. This recording has been going on for 1 hour and 21 minutes. I cannot tell you how many times I have to repeat statements. Hopefully that video is shorter than this. All right, bye.